3 ways to hand sew the binding on a quilt. So the first thing that you would do on this is to cut a strip of fabric lengthwise. And so these end to end to make them as long as your quilt needs it to be, to go all the way around the perimeter of the quilt. You would fold this in half and press it and then sew it to the edge of the quilt like this. The next step is to just fold this over here at the seam and then turn it around to the back. You can machine sew this, but it's a lot neater for me when I sew it by hand than it is when I sew it by machine. You can hold the quilt in different ways. You can just turn it to the back and work your way this way if you like to going towards the left. Or if you're left-handed, you can go towards the right this way. Or if you prefer, you can go from the front, fold the quilt under, and then sew to the direction that you want to go. So whatever way that works for you to hold the quilt is fine. This is my thread that I'm using to bind this quilt. You can see that it matches the binding fabric, and so it won't stand out. But for purposes of this demonstration, I'm going to use a bright red color so you can see exactly what I'm doing. I like to go this direction where I'm working from the back of the quilt. This makes a nice surprise for me. When I'm finished binding the quilt, I can turn the quilt over and it gives me a nice big reveal. What I like to do is to hold down. So I'm going to be starting to sew here. So what I like to do is to hold down this piece just a little bit ahead so that this will stay straight. This is not necessary. You can use your thumb to do it, but I like to have something to help me with this. A lot of things you can use. You can use a binder clip, and that'll hold it down. You can also use a paper clip. If you're using a paper clip, you want to make sure that you don't go in too far because these rough edges could get caught into the fabric. So this holds it down for you while you're sewing. You can also use a pin. You want to be careful when using a straight pin because your thread might get caught in here or you might get hurt with the sharp end, so you want to be careful with this. But I have managed to make quilts this way, so it is an option. If you're worried about the sharp end, you can also use a safety pin. That works. And that'll keep this section straight while you're sewing this part. And another option, this is the official way, I guess, is to use these little clips. They're made specifically for binding, and they will hold down the binding for you while you're working on the rest of the quilt. But this is really not a necessary purchase at all. Okay, so in order to bind the quilt, you can make a knot and hide it behind the binding so it won't show. I can go ahead and show you that part too. Just wrapping it around 3 times around my needle, and then I'm holding on to the wrap as I pull the needle out. And so here's my knot. And then I'm going to put it on the inside of the binding here, as close to the edge as I can get. And then it'll just be hidden underneath the binding. So the first way I'm going to show you is the blind hem stitch, and that's usually the most popular binding method. And so what you do is you go really close to where your thread is, underneath and to the quilt itself. Go a little bit ways forward. This will be about 1/4 of an inch or so inside in the quilt itself. You want to make sure that you go into the first layer. It's okay if you go into the second layer. If you go into the batting, it's not a problem at all. But you do want to make sure you don't go into the third layer. You don't want to go to the top of the quilt, because if you go through the top, it will show. And then when you do that, you want to go in right next to here, go in 1 or 2 layers, and then come up in the binding itself. And what I like to do is to look in the back. If I can see the needle here, then I've gone too deep. I need to start over again and make it not so deep. I'll show you what that looks like. So, and then you just pull it through. And there's a thread. You can see a little bit of the edge here, which is why you want to make sure that you are using a matching thread, but it really doesn't show very much even with the red thread. Let me show you what happens if you go in too far. You can see here, you can see my, I don't know if you can see the shiny needle right here. If I pull this through, this red, there'll be a little piece of thread that's over here. So it kind of helps if your thread matches the front of the quilt also. But so if that happens, you just pull this back out again, and you really haven't made it, gone too far to be able to get through it. And again, you can just go through just 1 or 2 layers, go in to the binding, go into the binding, and then just pull the thread through. If you have trouble, if this is a very thick fabric, this blue fabric is pretty thick, and so it is a little bit tough to get through sometimes. And if that's the case, you can just push either against a thimble or your table. This is a book under here, so you can push through that, and then can use that to help you. There you go. And then you can just keep going there. So this is the blind hem stitch where you're going into the quilt up to the binding, and you want to be pretty close to the edge of the binding so that your stitch is going to be really small. So just a few threads away from the edge of the quilt, edge of the binding, and then go straight, and then you just keep going all the way across to the end of the quilt. The other option that I personally think is a stronger for the quilt, because for me, when you look at this binding, it looks good. It's not very visible. It secures the binding to the back of the quilt, which so it does exactly what it's supposed to do. The issue though is that this, if you went too close to the edge of the binding, you could easily pop off the binding stitch. And so personally, I think a different stitch that works better to make sure that your binding is secure on the quilt is a ladder stitch. And that you go again here into the quilt next to where the thread is, but instead of going up through the binding, you're going straight through, just go make a straight line into the quilt itself. And so it's secure into the layers, and then go into the binding itself, and this is the stitch that's going to show, and then go straight through into the binding itself. So instead of going this way, you're going this way, like a ladder, up and down the ladder. So this stitch is going, this stitch that I just sewed, this stitch goes up to the binding, it goes straight in, it goes all the way across the binding, so the binding, the thread is inside the binding. And then the next stitch you're just making, going straight down into the quilt itself, straight. And so all of that is going to be hidden inside the quilt. And then you want to make the next stitch as small as you can, but not too small, and going straight through the binding. To me, the fact that it's going inside the binding just makes it more secure, so that even if it's not going to really be able to be popped off easily. And it looks exactly the same on the outside as the blind hem stitch did. And it doesn't really take any more time or effort to make this the ladder stitch than it did the blind hem stitch. Either one works. You can actually alternate if you want to. Whatever works best for you is fine. The other stitch that I like, and it's not common at all, but I've used it for my quilts, is to use a running stitch. Instead of trying to hide the thread, you can just have it show. Let me show you the running stitch, what it looks like. I'm going to use it on this side because it's a lot lighter. The fabric is not as heavy, and also the red will show better on here. Is instead of trying to hide the thread, you can make it just go straight through and show it. And this one is pretty fast because you can make more than one stitch at a time and just make the running stitch. And you will be able to see it. You can see the stitch, and you can, you know, make it even. If you make it even, then it will look good on the other side. But you can, this is a really fast way. This is the fastest way I know to bind it
by hand,
to sew down the binding, because you can make more than one stitch at a time. It does show on the back, but if you're using a nice decorative thread, then, or if you're using, say, invisible thread, that would work as well. Here's a quilt that I have made with the running stitch, and I think for this quilt, with the raw edges and the fun, playful nature of this quilt, the fun, playful binding goes really well with this. And it was really quick and easy to make. I used a nice thick thread that was very easy to show, and it goes well with the fabric that I use on this quilt. I make videos about quilting on this channel. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any of them. Thank you for watching. I appreciate all of your support, and I'll see you in the next video.